Night had fallen over the city, but the tension in the air was palpable. The summer heat was still present, mixed with the smell of smoke from the streets. Streetlights flickered, creating long shadows on the dirty sidewalks. The police operation was underway in the outlying neighborhood, where the sound of patrols broke the silence of the night. The city seemed to breathe through the tracks left by the officers on the narrow, congested streets. Carlos, a 15-year veteran of the force, was the patrol leader. His gaze was stern, almost implacable, reflecting the weight of years of frontline work. He had grown accustomed to the community's disdain for the police, but it never affected him. He believed that enforcing his authority was the only way to maintain order. After all, what he saw on the streets was a constant threat, a struggle between good and evil, between those who enforced the law and those who opposed it. As the patrol moved forward, the officers spotted a young black man, Lucas, walking quickly down the street, looking nervous. Carlos frowned. It wasn't unusual to see young men like that, but there was something about the boy that bothered him. The tension grew. "He looks like he's running from something," Carlos's partner muttered. Without hesitation, Carlos ordered the vehicle to stop and approached Lucas. The young man tried to avoid him, but was immediately surrounded. Carlos got out of the car with authority, approaching with firm steps, while his companions followed closely behind. "Where are you going?" he asked in a harsh and authoritative voice. Lucas quickly looked around as if searching for a way out. He was visibly nervous, but he didn't make any sudden movements. "I'm going home," Lucas replied, his voice low but firm. "You're lying," Carlos said, not giving the young man a chance to finish his sentence. He grabbed Lucas by the arm and squeezed him tightly. "Let's see who you really are." What followed was harsh treatment, a violent search, and the feeling that for Carlos, this young man was just another suspect, another example of someone who needed to be controlled. Lucas, without reacting physically, remained tense, with his hands raised. Deep down, I knew that what was happening was wrong, but the fear of being another victim of the system spoke louder. "I didn't do anything," he repeated, but his words were drowned out by the authority imposed by the police officer. Carlos pushed him toward the patrol car. "You're going to spend the night at the police station to explain this lie." The night dragged on as Carlos completed his shift, but the feeling of unease didn't leave him. There was something about that boy, Lucas, that wouldn't leave him. He found himself thinking about the way the young man had reacted when he was approached, the look of fear mixed with a kind of silent resistance. Maybe it was just the pressure of another day on patrol, but Carlos couldn't shake the image of Lucas. After his shift ended, Carlos went to the police station. He was tired, but his spirit was restless. As he walked through the doors to the treatment room, a familiar face caught his eye. It was his sister, Simone, whom he hadn't seen in years. He sat down, his eyes red, as if carrying the weight of a silent pain. Simone looked at him with a look that mixed surprise and a hint of resentment, but she said nothing. "Simone, what are you doing here?" Carlos asked, his voice tense. He didn't know how to face the meeting after so many years apart. The relationship between them had always been complicated, marked by a disagreement that distanced them. But seeing his sister there in that circumstance disconcerted him even more. Simone stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Carlos, and without hesitation said, "I came to talk about Lucas." Carlos stopped. "Lucas?" "Yes, Lucas. The boy you just arrested," she replied, pain evident in her voice. Shock hit Carlos like a wave of cold. I had heard the name before, but hadn't made the connection. "You attacked my son, Carlos. Lucas is your nephew." Those words fell like stones on Carlos's chest. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. His mind was in turmoil. The boy he had treated so brutally was actually his long-lost nephew. He tried to process the revelation as Simone spoke, but her words seemed distant. Anger, fear, and guilt were starting to take over him. Simone, with tears in her eyes, quickly told the story. After a family fight many years ago, she and Carlos separated. She had moved to another city, and Lucas grew up far from everything that Carlos's old life involved. During all this time, Carlos had been unaware of his nephew's existence. Now the truth was knocking on his door in a brutal way. Carlos felt his stomach churn. How could he have acted that way towards someone in his own family? His gaze wandered for a moment as he tried to recover from the revelation. He knew what had happened was desperate, but the pain of the discovery paralyzed him. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't know it was him." Simone shook her head, as if regretting her ignorance. "You didn't know, but now you know, Carlos. Now you must do the right thing." Carlos walked away from Simone, his steps heavy as his mind tried to digest what he had just learned. The revelation that the boy he had brutalized was actually his nephew hit him like a punch to the gut. How had he not known? How had he not noticed Lucas's suffering? Images of the approach came back to him, every detail now intensified by guilt. He walked to the police station window, and the night sky seemed darker than ever. His reflection in the window was no longer the same. It was as if something inside had broken. He had always felt that his authority as a police officer was unquestionable, but now, upon discovering that he was involved in the suffering of a member of his own family, he felt an unprecedented internal crisis. Simone, still in the room, looked at him with an expression of disappointment. Anger gave way to sadness, and the silence between them lasted for a few minutes. He knew that words were not enough to make Carlos understand the depth of what had happened. But I had to do something, and soon. The ringing of the phone in the treatment room broke the heavy silence. It was the police chief. "Carlos, you have to go to the hospital. Lucas is in a coma. The doctors are doing everything they can, but he was in serious condition after the attack." At first, the words seemed meaningless. The coma. Carlos didn't understand how that was possible. He was so focused on his own guilt that he didn't realize that the physical impact of the attack could be even more devastating than he imagined. Simone looked at him with desperate eyes. "Carlos, if you really care about our family, you will go there. Now." I didn't need anything else. Without saying a word, Carlos turned and ran toward the car. The drive to the hospital seemed long and endless. Every traffic light, every curve in the road seemed to lengthen, as if the universe wanted to delay Carlos's arrival at his destination. He needed to see Lucas. He needed to understand the gravity of what he had done. When he finally arrived, the image of the hospital hit him hard. The white walls, bright lights, and smell of disinfectant seemed to leave no room for any kind of comfort. He felt a wave of fear and regret. How could I fix what was so deeply wrong? The shame was so great that he could barely lift his head. Simone was there, waiting for him in the waiting room. When she saw him, she stood up, her eyes still swollen from crying. She stared at him tirelessly, as if waiting for an answer, something that would make sense of it all. "I don't know what to do," Carlos said, his voice breaking. Simone looked at him silently, but something in her eyes said she still believed in some form of redemption for him. "You can start, Carlos. What matters now is that you take responsibility for Lucas, for yourself, and for our family." Carlos walked over to a chair and sat down with his head down as the minutes seemed to pass. A decision was being made within him, but he still didn't know what the next step would be. The minutes inside the waiting room dragged on, and the clock in the corner of the wall seemed to mock the time Carlos felt he had lost. He didn't know what to do or what to say. He just watched the hospital doors open and close, while tension tightened his chest. Every second he spent inside amplified his guilt, and he knew he could no longer run away from his actions. Simone, sitting next to him, remained silent. her hands clasped nervously. She waited for an action, a gesture that perhaps would make Carlos finally understand the gravity of what had happened. They still had a long way to go, but looking at him, Simone still had hope, a belief that perhaps he could do something to fix the situation. Finally, a nurse appeared at the door of the waiting room, breaking the heavy silence. She looked at the two of them with a worried expression. "Are you Officer Carlos?" Carlos stood up immediately, his eyes fixed on the woman as if she were the only person capable of giving him the answer he needed. "Yes, I am. How is my nephew? Is he going to be okay?" The nurse sighed, a sound that reflected the tension of the moment. "His condition is serious. The impact to his head was severe. We're doing the best we can, but we have to wait for more tests to be done. He's in a medically induced coma. Now we can only wait." Those words fell like a bombshell, and Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to sink into the ground, disappear, but instead he felt an urgency take over him. He couldn't stay there, waiting for answers from the doctors. He needed to act. He needed to be more than the police officer who acted on impulse. I want to see Lucas," he asked, his voice breaking. The nurse looked at him for a moment, assessing the seriousness in his gaze before nodding. "You may follow me." Carlos followed the nurse through the hospital corridors, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the silence that surrounded them. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming, but she knew she needed to be there, with Lucas, to understand the real impact of her actions. When they arrived at the intensive care unit, the nurse opened the door. The room was dark, the only light coming from the machines monitoring Lucas's vital signs. He was there, lying in bed, submerged in tubes and wires, breathing with difficulty, but still kept alive by the medication. Carlos stopped at the door, not daring to approach. The child looked so small, so vulnerable. "I don't know what to do," Carlos muttered to himself, but the words were more of an outburst than a question. Simone entered the room behind him, her eyes red, but her determination growing. He approached Lucas and gently touched his hand. "You've already done something. The hardest part is over, Carlos." Carlos looked at her, the words stuck in his throat. "I don't know what you expect from me now. How can I fix this?" Simone looked at him with a serious but understanding expression. "What matters now is not what you have done, but what you will do from now on. Lucas, and all of us, need to see if you have the courage to be more than a police officer. We need you to be an uncle." Those words penetrated deeply, like a ray of light in the darkness. Carlos had never considered himself a family man, but suddenly everything seemed clearer to him. He could make a difference, not only for Lucas, but for himself as well. The promise of redemption would not come from a simple apology, but from a real change in his life. Simone watched him, waiting for him to find the answer. After a long moment of silence, Carlos, with teary eyes, finally approached Lucas's bed. "I'll do whatever it takes to correct my mistake. I won't give up on him." The promise was made, but the road to redemption would be long and arduous. However, for the first time, Carlos believed he could find a purpose beyond the police. He was willing to fight for his family, for Lucas, and for his own salvation. Carlos sat next to Lucas, his nephew's hand resting on the cold bed. The respirator was the only sound filling the room, and he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The promise he had made to Simone still echoed in his mind. He knew that from now on, his journey would not only consist of facing the consequences of his actions, but of striving to be someone worthy of the forgiveness he had not yet been able to grant himself. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Lucas remained in a medically induced coma, and Carlos silently visited the hospital every day, never giving up hope that the boy would wake up. He felt the pain of every moment he looked at his nephew and imagined everything he could have been, everything he could still be if he had acted differently. Simone, on the other hand, became a pillar of resistance. He seemed strong, but his tired eyes and expression did not go unnoticed. The concern for Lucas did not let her rest, but she still maintained hope, supported by the idea that Carlos was there to help her, finally, after so much time away. Carlos began to do little things to improve Lucas's situation. He contacted lawyers to make sure that any mistakes in his approach were corrected and that the necessary legal action was taken. But more important than any legal action, she knew that she needed to reconnect with Lucas somehow. He had to find a way to show that he was there, not just as a distant uncle, but as someone who finally understood the family's pain. It was then that he decided to take a step forward. One silent night, after visiting Lucas in the hospital, she went to her ex-mother's house, the place where it all began. He didn't know what he expected to find there, perhaps just the feeling of a reunion with his own past. When he arrived, the house was silent and empty, but soon memories began to wash over Carlos. The photos on the wall, the forgotten toys in the corner, and the antique furniture transported him back to a simpler time, a time when he still believed he could protect his family before he lost himself in his career and fear. That was when he realized it. He couldn't just erase what had happened, but he could try to make things right in a deeper way, going beyond his role as a police officer and seeing Lucas as a person, as someone he should have protected and cared for. The weight of guilt that had previously paralyzed him was now beginning to be replaced by a stronger motivation. Simone, noticing the changes in Carlos, trusted him again. She didn't expect him to solve everything at once, but she saw in him a man determined to redeem himself, and that was enough. In the days that followed, she encouraged him to speak to the authorities to ensure that Lucas received all the medical care he needed, and that those responsible for the attack were identified and held accountable. When Lucas finally woke up, his eyes searched for something familiar. Carlos was there, in the hospital, holding her hand and waiting for that moment to wake up. The boy looked at him confused, and Carlos, with a trembling voice, said, "I'm sorry, Lucas. I will do everything I can to make sure you and your mother are okay. I swear." Lucas, still weak, looked at him for a few seconds, perhaps recognizing more in Carlos's sincerity than in the words themselves. But there, in that moment, Carlos's journey towards redemption truly began. He didn't know what the future held, but he was willing to do whatever it took to correct the mistakes of the past and build something better for his family's future. Life in the hospital took on a new rhythm since Lucas woke up. The pain was still there, but a sense of relief hung in the air. Carlos continued to visit his nephew every day, and Simone, still cautious, began to allow him to get close. But Carlos's change in attitude did not consist only in being physically present, but in the actions he began to take outside those cold, sterile walls of the hospital. Carlos knew that true redemption would not come from simply supporting Lucas, but from facing the consequences of his own mistake. He no longer viewed his police career in the same way. The world of hierarchy and authority now seemed distant and empty compared to the urgency of healing the wounds caused by his violence. With Simone's support, he sought out lawyers who specialized in cases of abuse of authority. The family needed not only justice, but also transparency and accountability. He knew there was no excuse for what he had done, but he also knew he could not move forward without taking this step. The pressure of trials and investigations soon weighed on Carlos, but, contrary to what he imagined, he did not feel defeated. On the contrary, he felt that this was the only possible way to rebuild the broken trust with his nephew and with society. Simone took the lead in the legal process, called lawyers, investigated the case and began to get more actively involved. She also felt the pain of what had happened, but she didn't want Carlos's mistake to erase everything they could still build as a family. She didn't know if things would ever go back to normal, but she knew it was essential that Carlos was by her side. However, the situation began to get complicated. The media covered the case, and stories began to circulate about a police officer involved in abuse of power. Images of Carlos being detained by the authorities began to appear on social media. Some of Carlos's colleagues distanced themselves from him, while others seemed to want to ignore the scandal, hoping that everything would be resolved quickly. The weight of shame fell on Carlos's shoulders, but Simone and Lucas's support was what kept him strong. He couldn't go back, but at least he could make the truth heard, and people could see the process of his transformation. Carlos found himself for the first time without a uniform, without the police shield that had always protected him from public perception. Now he was just a man, trying his best to make amends for his mistakes. The feeling of vulnerability he felt was terrifying, but also liberating. He knew there was no longer any way to hide who he was or what he had done. Now everything was exposed, and he had to face the consequences in a way he never imagined possible. During this period of struggle, he began to seek support in therapy, something he had always been reluctant to do. Talking about his traumas, the pressures of his job, and most importantly, the loneliness he felt within himself, began to become central themes. He saw himself as a broken man, but at the same time with the opportunity to rebuild something meaningful from his ashes. Simone and Lucas, each in their own way, helped him maintain his sanity, offering him words of encouragement and also the silent presence that gave him the strength to carry on. The court process was slow, but the truth began to come out. Carlos took responsibility for what he had done. He did not try to justify himself or deny his actions. I knew there were no more excuses, but I also knew that the road to reconciliation would be long. The case against him had been a roller coaster ride, with moments of hopelessness and others of dim light at the end of the tunnel. The battle was just beginning, but Carlos felt he was on the right path, not only to redeeming himself, but to rebuilding himself. When the verdict was finally handed down, Carlos was given a sentence that reflected the weight of his actions. However, instead of feeling defeated, he felt a sense of relief. There was something profound about being held accountable for the consequences of his decisions. He was no longer running away. He was facing his mistake head-on, and that was a step towards forgiveness. Simone and Lucas, although still dealing with their own wounds, began to notice the change in Carlos. He was becoming someone different, someone willing to pay the price for his mistakes, and, in doing so, try to do something good for the future.